Hello, this is Eric Topol from Medscape, and I have an incredible privilege today for our one-on-one with Michael Lewis, the storyteller of our era, about his new book, The Premonition. Michael, welcome.
Thanks, Eric. Good to be back.
Yeah, I know we last spoke about the Unfolding Project, but you took it to another level with this one, and it's really quite extraordinary. What I found was especially fascinating, Michael, is the pre-pandemic warm-up that went on almost 15 years here. And just to lay out the protagonists for the listeners, we had this 13-year-old girl, Laura Glass, with her father, Bob, in Albuquerque, like in 2004. And then we had the incredible public health physician in Santa Barbara, Charity Dean, Dr. Dean. We had the Wolverine group of 7 doctors. And then we had Joe Desai, who I know in UCSF, Chan Zuckerberg, right? So
Joe DeRisi, yeah.
DeRisi, I'm sorry, yes, Joe
That's right.
DeRisi. So firstly is we're going to see how all these people come together in the book. How did you find these people?
I was looking for people through whose eyes I wanted to see this event. And I was looking for people who could teach me things that I didn't know. And they landed in my lap in various ways. So Joe DeRisi at UCSF was the easiest find, because 5 years ago, I published a book called Flash Boys. I ended up at a dinner with a San Francisco money manager who wanted to talk to me about the book. And then he said, I have a character who's even better. I have a character for your next book. His name is Joe DeRisi, and he's opening this institution called the Chan Zuckerberg Biohub, and you meet him and you'll be smitten. And people do this to me a lot. It's like, yeah. And there's a lot of polite nodding, and I'll take your business card, and then I go hide. He was so insistent that I actually went and had a sandwich with Joe DeRisi, and I came away. And Joe DeRisi is a virus hunter. I mean, he's sort of like a freelance rogue virus hunter attached to UCSF, but really an interesting man. But when I met him, he'd already hunted down snake pandemics and pandemics in exotic birds, and he'd figured out how to use his genomic technology, sequencing technology that he had invented to identify unidentified encephalitis. It was one thing after another.
And he was the original SARS. He cracked the case for SARS in 2003.
Right.
He made the sequence of it. Yeah.
He made the sequence quickly, like in hours.
Right.
And I just thought, when I met him, I don't deserve this character. I think of characters as earned rights. Like, what right do I have to write about this? I got a D in biology my sophomore year in high school. I placed out of my science requirement in college by taking something called physics for poets. It just felt almost inappropriate, almost obscene to just seize him, even though he was so interesting. I thought some good science writer will pick him up. But I made a little folder over here. I put my folder next to my desk. It said Joe DeRisi on it. And when the pandemic was on early stages, March, I called him up, and no one had found him. He was still kind of virgin territory. And I said, what are you doing? And he said, well, the CDC has a test that doesn't work, and so we've turned the biohub into a COVID testing lab, and we're going hunting for the virus. So that was case number one. Each of the characters, there's a story a bit like that, of someone saying to me. In every case, someone said to me, "You've got to go talk to this person." Yeah. And in the case of Charity Dean, it was 5 different people said it. In the case of the doctors, the Wolverines, it was people who were associated, who helped me indirectly with the Fifth Risk, the book I wrote about the federal government and as a manager of existential risks. And they had come, anybody who was kind of near the pandemic space knew these guys, because 2 of them had helped really create the country's pandemic strategy, and had all 7 of the Wolverines had spent time working in the White House. And they were this odd collection. This whole notion of doctors in public policy. Yeah. When you go to Washington, you start talking to people about public policy, you're inevitably talking to some lawyer. And usually and even if they're talking about science stuff, they sort of were quick studies, and they aren't subject matter specialists. The fact that these doctors, real doctors who had actually had hands-on patients, had kind of wandered into the creation of a public policy, and that they found in each other companionship, inspiration, a team, and that they had been together for kind of 15 years, better part of 15 years. And whenever there was an outbreak anywhere in the world, MERS or SARS or Ebola, they were positioned in different parts, either in the federal government or close to it, in prominent places where they could have some effect on disease management. I thought that was riveting.
Oh, yeah, no question.
And as you point out, it was clear to me when I started this thing that we weren't even going to get to the pandemic in the book till halfway through it, because what happened before told you so much about what was going to happen during.
Yeah, I mean, that in a way, you could have used the plural, the premonitions, because each of these four groups or protagonists had their own premonition path, right? And on the cover, you had the dots, and I was trying to figure out, are the dots the Laura Glass model, or are the dots the 5,000 public health people that respond to nobody?
So the idea of the dots. The idea of the dots they do refer. So I'm going to explain the Laura Glass model. The dots are, if you look at the cover, it's one becoming two, and then creeping around the edge are other dots. It's exponential growth. It's the way the way a virus replicates. But this Laura Glass story, I mean, it is sort of an example of the quality of the material I was working with.
Oh,
that you had this scientist at Sandia Labs named Bob Glass, who kind of all-purpose scientist, a very smart man, who was working with a computer model he had created called an agent-based model. And his daughter was watching him play with his model. And on the screen, there were all these green dots, but one red dot. And they moved, he explained, according to rules that he wrote for them. And he was trying to do things like show the way gossip spread, or the way an angry person became a mob, or the way a panicked person in the financial markets became a financial crash, the way information kind of cascaded through. And she was looking at it, and she was thinking, oh crap, another year is rolling around and Dad's going to require me to enter the science fair again. And that's not completely fair. She really loved doing it, I think. But Bob Glass was a little league dad. But instead of baseball, it was science fair. And she looked at it and she said, that could be the science fair project, because that reminds me of the way disease spreads. And she'd been reading about bubonic plague in her classes. So they said about modeling disease spread. And it started out as a sweet little project, and then it spun completely out of control. It went on for several years. Bob Glass roped in like the smartest programmer he knew at Sandia. So that it was like hiring, LeBron James and and Steph Curry to come play on your pickup basketball game team.
Yeah.
But this model they create is a very stylized but really interesting thing, because she does all this research about how people interact in their community. How many face-to-face interactions? How close are you? How many people do you see in a day? Where do you see them? And they sort of built rules for these citizens in the community to move around, and then they started to predict about where people would be infected, how they'd be infected, how fast they'd be infected. They moved from plague to flu as the disease, and they start to see that you can do things in this community to really jam up transmission of disease, and in particular, for whatever, given the rules, closing schools has a huge effect.
Oh yeah.
Bob Glass is sitting there in 2006 looking at the epidemiological literature, and in the literature it says basically, the playbook is wait for a vaccine. It's the so-called non-pharmaceutical interventions have supposedly been discredited way back in 1918. At the same time, these two doctors in the White House, Richard Hatchett and Carter Mesher, are sitting there trying to answer the question, what do you do when a pathogen is loose in the society and before you get a vaccine? How do you slow it? How do you prevent illness and death until you get a vaccine? And they didn't have they had very fancy people turning up with the early disease models, like Neil Ferguson from Imperial College, who later, I mean, these people who end up being giants in their fields. But Carter Richards said these models were so complicated, we couldn't really use them to experiment with. We couldn't ask questions like what do you do what happens if you ban large gatherings? What happens? And Carter Mesher in the White House knows somebody who used to date Bob Glass's sister, who knows about this kid's science project, who sends him the model in the mail. And so Bob Glass, who had been spent the better part of a year banging on the doors of epidemiologists saying, please, can you look at this thing? And them not answering the door. The White House calls and says, this model seems really cool and really great. Can you get on a plane and come to the White House? And this model is one of the tools they use to design the pandemic strategy that ends up saving a lot of lives in other countries, because the plan gets exported. But it becomes a very real thing. And the punchline to it all is Laura Glass doesn't win the science fair.
That's crazy. Yeah,
it's crazy.
You end up the book telling us that. I say, what? Now, this is amazing actually to me, because this warm up in the White House under the Bush administration, which was a surprise, where Bush wanted a pandemic preparatory plan, and he brings in Rajiv
Venkaya,
Venkaya, and then Venkaya brings in these two doctors that you just mentioned, Richard and Carter. Carter's like known as Rain Man, I guess, because he's data, everything data. Yeah. It turns out Rajiv writes the pandemic plan. He ghost writes it for the CDC, writes it in 6 hours, and Carter writes the CDC social distancing plan, authored by him, even though it's, purported to be by CDC. Now, what's amazing to me is that PNAS paper that you really get into, which is 2007, the St. Louis Philly. Okay, so up until this time, that paper is like one of the most cited papers during the pandemic, Michael, because social distancing, masked and social distancing.
Well, it's an amazing story of people pursuing a solution to the ends of the earth. They're sitting there with a very skeptical public health community. They've got this toy model that is part of some girls' science fair project. And the public health community is not totally persuaded by the model. The models are not in vogue at that time. And so, and they're looking at the evidence the other side is offering, which is that people did this in 1918 and nothing happened. It didn't work. And Carter is reading. Carter actually just accidental. The boss, Rajiv, says to Carter, I was supposed to be in a panel with the guy who wrote the book on 1918, John Barry. I can't make it. Could you do it? And Carter goes, oh God, I better read his book. So he goes and reads the book, and he notices that in the book, it's a story of carnage, right? It's like people just die. And it's the wave of disease spreading across the country. There's no sense in the book that anybody did anything that worked or helped. But Carter's noticing that, but in the book, you can see the outcomes that are not the same in, say, St. Louis and Philadelphia. Yeah. Why? Yeah. And they go back and they reinvestigate this event, this incredibly important historical event, and they discover something new. And the new thing they discover is that there was a reason that St. Louis had a fraction of the death of Philadelphia. The measures they introduced, closing saloons or whatever it was, and they went back to the newspapers at the time to find out what they did, were earlier in relation to the arrival of the virus in the city. And that actually this stuff did work. People just did not see it at the time. It was sort of fog of war. And so they write this, they themselves, Richard's very funny. I mean, we have an audience of doctors, right? So these are two doctors. They don't think of them. They're not academics. They don't, as Richard said, we were just a couple of buffoons, and Carter and I, and we wouldn't know a regression analysis if it bit us in the ass. And so they say that we got to find somebody to do this with. They actually pick up and discard a couple of potential partners, but they end up working with Mark Lipsitch. Mark Lipsitch at Harvard, and who says, like, these guys are incredibly interesting. Of course, you'd work with them. And Mark Lipsitch, he does know how to do a regressions analysis, and he's a giant in his field. And this, you're right. They change opinion about this idea, and this whole, and so this is the story of The idea that these interventions, these non-pharmaceutical interventions, are going to have some effect. And it is breathtaking. I mean, I think,
Oh,
you never know how history would have played out without these two men,
yeah.
but I mean, I think you can make a case that they've saved hundreds of thousands of lives.
Oh, probably over the years with the
Yeah,
other
yeah,
pandemics, who knows how many, because this is back, they published it in '07.
right.
They challenged the dogma, as you're pointing out, that was widely accepted that distancing doesn't really make a difference, that, you just have to accept the fate of the pandemic. Maybe masks help a little bit, but, so that was a really landmark paper.
Carter is this working class guy
Yeah.
who his dad is, is a like a tool and die maker. He's a by nature kind of an engineer type, right? Who became a doctor, and the doctor stories. I mean, that he becomes a doctor. As he says, I have ADD or ADHD or one of those damn things. That he couldn't. He had trouble focusing problems, and he still does. When you interview him, ask
Hmm.
him a question, and he gives you a 20-minute answer to some other question that was a better question that you should have asked. But that's not the kind of person who usually goes into medicine. I mean, I can remember my friends in college who were all pre-med. They were very focused. They didn't get through. You didn't get through organic chemistry by answering the wrong question.
Right.
You're right. But this person manages to have the brain power to basically teach himself. Classrooms weren't really his thing. Mind would wander. And then he gets in an ICU and finds his calling in an ICU because,
Yeah.
as he said, it was like Ritalin. So you get into an ICU and my decisions are going to determine whether this person lives or dies. All of a sudden I was engaged. And that he manages to bottle that feeling and move it with him as instead of saving the life of a patient, he's saving the life of a hospital. Then he's saving the life of 9 hospitals, managing hospitals in the Veterans Administration. And then he's thinking, I got to save the society. That he had this kind of need for urgency, I found was just made for a really interesting character.
No, no question. He is fascinating. I mean, all these characters are fascinating, but I want to turn to the one who I thought was the most colorful of all, and that's Dr. Charity Dean. She's a really interesting physician in Santa Barbara, where you tell the story about how she cracked the case of a hepatitis C outbreak through this so-called orthopedic medicine doctor who was obviously kind of a scam there, treating all these rich and famous people in Santa Barbara. Then she goes on in the UC Santa Barbara meningococcemia outbreak, a major outbreak. She cracks that and gets all over. I mean, she's actually a phenomenal public health physician. She gets empowered and moves to Sacramento, right, to be the California kind of number 2, but a distant number 2, or as you called it, L6, level 6. Maybe you could tell everybody what L6 is and kind of her role, because I mean, she seems fascinating.
Well, she is fascinating. And the first thing that fascinated me about her was that she'd had this pretty traumatic upbringing, in that she'd grown up in this very religious community that really frowned upon women getting an education. And that she had a lot of reasons to have a lot of fear, a lot of bad things that happened to her. And that she had decided, really for the sake of herself, but also for the job she had to do, that she had to kind of will herself to be brave. And this willed bravery was an interesting thing to me. So no matter how much fear I have, I'm just going to be brave. And that this quality becomes necessary over and over and over again. And in the pandemic, that she is told by her boss early in January or mid-January and into February, don't use the word pandemic. You're scaring people. Don't do your math on your whiteboard showing how if we don't do anything, 20 million people in California are going to be infected. Don't do this, don't do that. Shut her out of meetings. She was just marginalized. Another person would have been cowed. So what happens? That we'll enter her story at the top, which is she's sitting there thinking that she's been sidelined for an event she's prepared for her whole life. She is, I think, without question, the most qualified person in the state of California government to be running pandemic response. And she's not allowed to even talk to anybody about it.
Hmm.
And into the Newsom administration roll some Silicon Valley software programmers and entrepreneurs. The one who's chiefly responsible for what ensues is a fellow named Todd Park, who he's founded 3 separate billion-dollar healthcare companies. Athena is, I think, one of them.
In
And
health.
yeah, and uh, but he's very recessive, like very modest, like a very modest guy. He has a reputation for fixing other people's problems without taking credit for it. Among the problems he helped fix was the health.gov problem in the Obama administration. Obama brought him in to become the chief technology officer for the United States. So he's had that experience. So Todd Park writes a note to a friend who's Newsom's, chief aide, and says, "Look, I'm praying for you. If you need anything, call me." And the guy calls him right away, says, "Get here as fast as you can, because we need to figure out what this thing is going to do to California." And this is kind of late March, third week of March or so. And he gets there, and Todd Park has a very interesting attitude towards big institutions, not just government institutions, also big private companies. His attitude is, if there's a crisis, there's usually someone in the institution who knows the answer to the crisis, but they're usually not where they need to be. That the organization chart is what the organization chart is. It is not designed for the crisis that happened. So when you get to a place, you just got to root around and ask, like, who knows about this? So he rooted around and said, like, who actually here knows about communicable disease? And everybody knew that Charity Dean, she'd been talking about the pandemic they'd just seen her in action too many times. And so he's in a room with her, and he's asking her questions about, how do you think about this thing? What do you think is coming? Why do you think it's coming? He just picks her brain. After a couple of hours, he says to her, "You're why I'm here. I'm not here to just build an abstract model for Gavin Newsom to analyze disease spread. My job is to get everything in your mind onto Gavin Newsom's desk." And they build a model, but the model is simply to get everything Charity Dean knows as the assumptions in the model, to scare the hell out of Gavin Newsom to shut down the state. And that's what happens. And what Todd Park says is, this person, Charity Dean, I've seen her over and over and over again in various forums, and she's always 6 levels down in the organization from the top. So yeah. I call them the L6. Yeah, so Charity was the L6.
Well, what's so great about that part is, here I am, we both live in California, and we know March 19th, we get in a government order from Newsom that is a stay at home, the first in the country. Little do we know that it's Dr. Dean who's making the call, and that Ken Cuccinelli from the White House is calling to get advice from Dr. Dean.
After she does that, Todd Park and the group of people who come in to help Newsom say, "You're like the person who knows what to do. Go into a room and write a plan for the state of California." And she says, at this point, I can write a plan for the state of California, but it's got to be a plan for the country. It can't be just for the state of California. She said, I could have given you a plan for the state of California in late January, which involved, checkpoints on highways and testing people inside airports and sort of reverse cordoning ourselves. But it's too late already for that. The virus is all over the country. We need a national response to mitigate it. So she writes this plan. So this plan, because these guys who are there are connected, it's instantly in the hands of a man named Andy Slavitt, who's been helping run the Biden administration's response, who is been in conversations with Jared Kushner, who's looking for a plan. And Charity's plan basically gets forwarded, not as her own. She can't put her name on it because she works for Gavin Newsom. She can't be writing plans for the Trump White House. To Jared Kushner. And word comes back that Trump is actually all on board with this thing. And she thinks that the next day at a press conference, he's going to announce the plan. And instead, something happened. She still doesn't know what happened. I mean, I think the problem is it demanded some sacrifice and accountability from everybody. And he wasn't willing to ask for that. But she is on these phone calls with, these characters come together. The Wolverines are very early on in diagnosing what's going on in Wuhan. By January 20th, they have a bead on the transmissibility and the lethality. Enough of a bead that they know it's coming and it's going to be bad. They are shocked that the CDC and the Trump administration are saying no real threat to Americans. And that goes on for more than a month. So they know, seeing that there's no coordinated federal response, they start looking for governors that they know and they can talk to. And if you can map the U.S. response right on to the social relationships they happen to have. Ohio, Maryland, and California through Charity Dean.
Right.
They have a way to speak to the governors of those states, and those are the three states that closed early. So you got the Wolverines kind of trying to manage this thing in a really like third best solution way, and they rope in Charity as the person they can talk to at in the state of California, and she finds herself on these conference calls, and the conference calls, she never knows who's on. There are people lurking, and she gets the sense that people from the Trump White House are lurking. And one time she's speaking up about what needs to happen right after she's written her plan. And Ken Cuccinelli, who's like, what is he, Deputy Director of Homeland Security? He's in the White House, says,
Right.
yes, do that, you need to do that. And she says, no, you need to do that. I'm just a nobody in the middle of it. It's a remarkable,
Yeah,
moment.
it really is. And, the fact that the Wolverines came together with the Wolverette, Dr. Dean, and how they worked together. I mean, when they contacted her, they thought, well, she's got to be the one empowered. And here she was, as you say, marginalized, but somehow or other, they helped get her into that power position. Now, I broke out into laughter in the book, Michael, in the chapter called Plastic Flowers. When I heard Charity Dean with the story, you got to tell the story.
I got to tell is this you're the
Such
first
a metaphor? It's so great.
So when she told me that's the story, I thought this belongs in the book, and it's kind of a metaphor for the whole U.S. response. But you're the first person to ask me about it, so I would love to tell it. So she was a newly divorced medical student at Tulane Medical School in New Orleans. Divorced because the church elders had basically said, you need to come home. Your husband he says he's being neglected. Get out. She had to make a choice between her marriage and her education, and she chose her education. She got her own apartment. She moves into this apartment, and it's got this wonderful balcony, and everybody who's in the apartment complex has to walk by it to get to their apartment. And it's a lot of medical students and young professionals and like people she wants to get to know. And she first thing she says, she kind of channels her mother, she says, and she gets all these flowers and bought flowers and plants them. And she has the most beautiful porch full of flowers. But she herself has absolutely no ability to keep a flower alive. And she's also studying her butt off in medical school and getting her master's in public health. And the flowers start to die. They don't die all at once. First, there's just like a little bald patch in one of the flower beds. And by this time, she's got the reputation of being like the woman with the beautiful flowers. And everybody's praising her flowers. And she's invested in this new identity. I'm the kind of person who has this beautiful porch. Well, she realizes that she doesn't know how to keep these things alive. So she goes to like Michael's Arts and Crafts. Oh, no, actually, it starts because she happens to have some plastic flowers in her house. So she just takes the plastic flowers to fill in the bald spots. But then more flowers start to die. So she goes to Michael's Arts and Crafts, and she realizes the beginning of the descent when she's looking at these fake flowers in the arts and crafts store and trying to pick them based on the ones that look most like real flowers in her bed. And she's buying bundles and bundles of these things. And before long, all the flowers are fake. And they depend for their effect on people, some distance between them and the flowers. So now she's keeping everybody at a distance because, people would come on her porch to have drinks with her and smell the flowers. And now she can't let them on the porch because if they get on the porch, they're going to find out. And so she engages as this incredibly energetic charade of being a person who actually has the beautiful flower beds until one day some guy knocks on her door and she doesn't grab him in time. And he runs out onto the porch, leans over, and she says he recoiled in horror when he realized that these things were plastic. And Charity told that story to a point. And she said she feels like that was the CDC. That the CDC, once upon a time, a long time ago, had these beautiful flower beds. But slowly but surely, they once upon a time had the power to control disease. But slowly but surely the flowers died, and they replaced the flowers with plastic flowers, and the effect of the institution on people depended on a certain distance. And what happened in this pandemic was we were all brought with our nose right against the plastic flowers, and we realized this place it's not what we thought it was.
Now, when you read this book and you undress the CDC, through these various, characters and stories, you start to get, if you're a conspiracy theorist, and there's no shortage of those around these days, you start to get the impression that maybe the CDC was trying to kill us all.
Ha! That's a very interesting observation, because it's I, obviously the people in the CDC are not that way. No, they're not. But if you ask yourself, if you were a Russian spy who was put into to run the CDC, and you had to do things in the beginning of the pandemic to maximize the devastation of this disease, well, what would you do? First thing you do is you make yourself a single point of failure. You'd say nobody's allowed to test. You'd get the FDA in on it. You say nobody's allowed to use any test but our test, right? So stop it, you people in those thousands of microbiology labs you have, from doing anything. You're not allowed to do that. Second, you'd say the test is on the way, and it's kind of great. And then when it arrives and it doesn't work, you'd say, oh, well, we'll fix it. And you'd still stall a few more weeks. By this time, the virus is all over the country. You would do things, you would pretend to check people who were returning from China for COVID and track them. But instead, actually, you'd only pretend, you wouldn't take their home addresses. You'd write down next to their names, they live at Los Angeles Airport or O'Hare Airport, where they entered, so that nobody could find them ever again. You would, when you got a call from a Wolverine named James Lawler, who ran a federal medical facility in Omaha, Nebraska, which is designed to take in people who've got terrifying new diseases and treat them and prevent them from infecting others. When James Lawler calls you and says, I've got 84 people who've just been repatriated from Wuhan and I want to test them for COVID, you'd find an excuse not to let him. And the excuse, in this case, Robert Redfield said, you're not allowed to test them even though they want to be tested, because to do so would be performing experiments on imprisoned persons. So you do all the stuff they did. And it's hard to think of what
not
trick.
Even acknowledging it's airborne, not even saying you should wear masks.
I mean, it goes on and on and on. Yeah. It's hard to think of a trick they missed in maximizing the damage that this thing caused, especially early on, especially the first few months, 3 or 4 months. So this is not the story I set out to write. You got to trust me on this. I wasn't like looking for the CDC to be the villain. In fact, that message, in a funny way, it doesn't really, but it sort of seemingly conflicts with the whole point of the previous book I wrote about how important these government institutions are and how the people inside them are sometimes treasures. I think that's still true of the CDC, but even in spite of all this, but it just was not the institution I thought it was. And every single one of my characters, every single one of them, lead me to this conclusion. It's their interactions with them.
Yeah.
It's Charity Dean before Donald Trump, years before Donald Trump is president. It's Charity Dean trying to fight disease outbreaks in Santa Barbara County and dealing with, terrifying events on the UCSB campus with terrifying outbreaks of multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. And over again, finding that this institution that's meant to have her back, the CDC, instead is basically saying to her, all the risk of containing this is yours. Yeah. And if you screw up and cause a controversy unnecessarily, it's your neck that's on the chopping block. And we're not going to act or endorse anything you do until we have perfect data. And they get so obstructive that she actually bans them from her investigations. Now, so Charity Dean is the canary in the coal mine. She could have told you by 2014 that this institution is not a battle-ready institution. It's more of an academic institution. And when the battles are fought, they're not there. They come in afterwards and they collect data about, they're military historians.
Yeah, you had a good acronym, the CDOR, the Center for Disease
Observation and Reporting.
I thought the CDC problems really came along with Robert Redfield and the Trump administration, but it's so deep. And so when you told the story about the swine flu epidemic, that was really illuminating.
So the question is, when were the flowers ever real? You know, at what point when you smelled them did they smell like flowers? And the reputation was there for a reason. It wasn't always this way, right? And the you read books about the early days in the CDC, and even it's created after World War II. I think its original mission, if I'm not wrong, was to eliminate malaria from the American South. One of the reasons is in Atlanta. There's some accidental reasons it's in Atlanta too. And they go out to eliminate, but actually find it's not there. The problem's already solved for whatever. I don't know how that happened, but they eliminate smallpox. I mean, that's one of the great triumphs. I mean, it really is CDC, the World Health Organization's involved, but it's really American led, this thing. They do great stuff. And you read like the memoirs of Bill Foege, who was the director in the late 70s and early 80s. You're reading the work of a kind of a great man. I mean, you read it and you think this guy's a man of total integrity. He's modest. He's a man of principle, and he really did fight disease with his bare hands. But Foege also tells you another story, and the story is how this institution started to shift right before he took control of it, and how it shifted even further during the Reagan administration when he was in charge of it. The story goes back to the swine flu non-pandemic of 1976, when there is an outbreak of a new strain of swine flu at Fort Dix in New Jersey. Some soldiers get it. It's highly transmissible. A soldier dies. It's treated as like as a warning shot for what's going to happen when flu season comes in the fall. Experts gather at the CDC. The CDC is then a totally civil service run operation. Has not been really politicized. The experts concur that the thing to do is to get a vaccine as fast as possible and to store it not in refrigerators, but in people's arms. And the decisions for that is made because if they wait until they find out there's actually a swine flu epidemic or pandemic, a lot of people are going to die before they can get the vaccine in their arms. It's not a trivial matter getting the vaccines, as we can see, in the arms of 200 or however many Americans there were at the time, 200 million plus. So David Sencer is the director of the CDC, and he does something that Bill Foege watches. Feige's a young man at the CDC. He's watching Sencer run this meeting where everybody basically agrees what they need to do. They also understand there's some risk, right? You don't stick needles into 200 million arms without something bad happening. So Sencer says he doesn't take a vote. He just writes a memo to his boss basically to the president, saying this is what we recommend. And he says to Foege, I got to do it this way because if it goes wrong, someone needs to take the fall. And I don't want this whole group to take the fall. It's going to be me. It'll be on me. Foege thought, if ever I'm in that position, I hope I have the courage to do what he did. Well, flash forward to the fall. There is no swine flu pandemic. No one knows why. There's no answer to that question still. Why? How did it go away? It was the first time in history that they knew of a new pathogen that was that transmissible that didn't find its way through the population. And the second thing that happens is some people die from the vaccine, before the vaccine's pulled.
Guillain-Barré, yeah, too.
Yep, that's right. I've never figured out how to pronounce that, but yes, thank you. And he, and so you've got, Sencer becomes the fall guy. He falls on his sword. He's banished from his tribe, the public health tribe in Atlanta. He never goes back to Atlanta. His son tells a really heartbreaking story about this and how he descended into alcoholism. It was, he bounces back eventually, but it was a really sad story what happened to him after
terrible,
that. Yeah. And he did the right thing and we punished him for it. Foege his last act. He asked the Carter administration, he said, okay, I'll fall on my sword, but please appoint Bill Foege as my successor. It was sort of the last true civil service appointment in that job. Because what happens is the Reagan administration rolls in, and Foege all of a sudden finds that the White House is paying a lot more attention to what's going on at the CDC. And when they publish findings that young children given aspirin sometimes develop Rye syndrome, that the aspirin manufacturers come down hard through the White House, their donors to the Reagan administration, and the research is shut down or made to do it all over again, slowed. Foege is so upset with this that actually put young children's lives at risk for the sake of some aspirin manufacturers' profits, that he quits.
Yeah.
And he says to me, I wish I hadn't quit, because actually that if I made them fire me, it would have been a messy thing, because I was there. I was not there at the grace of the Reagan administration. I was a permanent civil servant. I had protection. They would have to show like malfeasance on my part. The Reagan administration must have seen this, because what they do right away then is they turn that job into a politically appointed job. And that's a drift our government has went on for a while, where these jobs that were permanent civil service became presidential appointees, political jobs. And that has a big, big effect on the incentives in the institution. Because one, all of a sudden the person who's picked for the job is picked out of a smaller pool of people who are politically pleasing to whoever's in the White House. So you're not picking from the big pool, and so you're likely not to get as good a person. Two, you're on the short leash that the president can now fire you on a whim, and you're going to be paying a lot more attention to what the president wants rather than what you think the institution needs. And when those things are in conflict, you may be deferring to the president when you really shouldn't be. Three, it does this other thing that, generally speaking, these presidential appointees last in office 18 months to 2 years. And how long they actually last, they don't really ever much last beyond the term of the president, right? And so you might last 7 years, but you get president appointed by Obama early on and you last through 2 terms, but you don't know it. And you're kind of thinking this is a pretty short-term gig. And you're dealing with short-term problems, and you're doing that possibly at the expense of the very long-term interests of the institution. And that, I think that's a really big deal. I think that an institution that's managed by someone who's only going to be there a couple of years, or assumes they're only going to be there a couple of years, is different from an institution that's managed by someone who thinks they're going to be there for 15 years.
That wasn't the intent of the book, but what you went through from all these different characters is the failure of the public health system. These are the characteristics of our CDC, even through the administration. And in part, even now, we're starting to see, the conflicts of demasking, trying to do the right thing, trying to be bold, and then now having, this confusional state engendered. So do you think there's something to that, this kind of becoming more, lacking boldness, fearful?
What you do in that institution is you create a bias towards inaction, because the sins of commission get punished, like vaccinating people before a pandemic that doesn't happen. You get the death penalty for that.
Yeah.
Whereas if you wait, like they did with this one, if you wait, it's too late. It's already all over the place. Could never have done anything about it anyway. That narrative is easier to tell. A sin of omission is easier to cover than a sin of commission, and dealing with the disease is easier for them than actually insisting on prevention. Yeah. So I think that I'm willing to be argued with. I'm not the official historian of the CDC, but this seemed to be a really important moment and a really important change at the top.
I want to get to one other topic before we wrap up, which is, I think, an essential one. And also interdependent with the CDC, and that's genomics of the virus. So here the CDC's got 1.2 billion to do genomics of the virus, and nothing's happened yet. And as you pointed out in the book, at one point it was not even 1% of the samples that were getting sequenced. And I love the line that Charity Dean had in there, which was, you could tell who farted in a crowd from the genome sequence. Also, you're making a movie. Basically, you're following spatio-temporally the virus.
That's right.
And it's incredible, powerful tool, right?
Yep.
And you could tell now if somebody has a breakthrough infection like the Yankees, you could say, you know what, it was this guy. He came in, he infected the whole other 8 people. All through sequencing. Yep. But there's no plan. There's no system now. And so can you you really nailed it. I mean, I know you're not a genomicist, but you really nailed its importance, and we're not doing it right here.
So you're getting back to the question you asked me about how I found or chose these characters. And one of the traits that's actually essential in any character of mine is that they be an unbelievable teacher. because they've got as their student a total ignoramus, me. And Joe DeRisi was an unbelievable teacher about the importance of this technology. It was his lifelong obsession, and could explain really clearly the way we were blowing it, and really blowing it because this particular virus is so perfectly trackable. Because it mutates once every 1 or 2 transmissions. If it didn't mutate at all, I mean, that's a thought experiment. You couldn't track it. There'd be no change from one. You couldn't show that your infection was a downstream mutation from my infection, and there was one error in the code, and so quite likely you either got it from me, or at most there was one person between us. You couldn't do any of that. If it mutated really, really fast, like the common cold does. I mean, these are interesting things I had no idea existed. That the common cold makes errors in itself so fast that inside of a single human body, it mutates around any potential vaccine. So that's just a mess. There are just too many fingerprints at the crime scene to figure out who committed the crime. But in this case, this thing it makes errors in itself in almost the perfect way to use this technology to track it. And the power of that is, so tracking one is, if there's a variant that escapes the vaccine, sure, it would be nice to know, right? And the only way you know that is if you're sequencing the virus. Otherwise, you don't even know it. It happened and you didn't know it. But the other thing is that in the tracking of it, this is my redneck disease control understanding of the matter. I was watching, as I was reporting the book, various enterprises trying to control the disease. And it would be nursing homes, or it would be local health offices in rural counties thinking of trying to protect, like Humboldt County, or it was factories trying to reopen, or schools. And in every case, it seemed to me, they had the same problem, in that they were designing their environment to be safe in the presence of this virus. It's like, make sure that the tables are spaced 10 feet apart or 6 feet apart, or whatever it is. And so there's kind of practicing hygiene inside the environment. And at the same time, trying to guard against the thing coming into the environment. And the two things, transmission within the environment and transmission from outside, are different things. Okay. And if you can distinguish between it, it's very powerful. So, for example, Joe DeRisi gets 2 positive COVID tests from a single factory, a plant in rural California. I think it's a fish packing plant. And the plant was about to close down because, oh my God, we have an outbreak. Something's wrong inside the plant. They assume these 2 people, one of them gave it to the other. We have to figure out how to redo our assembly line. But no, the 2 viruses were genetically completely dissimilar. The 2 people had got it separately from outside. So the problem is the border control. Don't let those people into the plant. You shouldn't. That was the mistake. It wasn't a mistake inside. And it seems to me that if you're engaged in hand-to-hand combat with this virus, knowing that your walls are insecure, or your inside the walls are insecure, is an important thing. It also tells you the thing that was so fascinating to me, and I still can't believe how little attention this has gotten. The genetic relationships reveal social relationships. So if you were having an affair with my wife, I may find out this way. Now, this may be one of the reasons we're resistant to it, but it's really important when you're in the middle of a pandemic to get deep understanding of your society's social relationships. It's really important to know that this particular neighborhood has a high concentration of workers who have to leave the neighborhood to a place that's not safe, and they're coming back and they're bringing the virus back with them. Or that these guys sitting on the wall of the park are infecting each other when they're playing chess, or whatever it is.
Yeah, well, here we have our listeners, our physicians in healthcare, and they could be getting the infection from patients, from their fellow colleagues, or they could get it from they're going to the grocery store.
Right.
And this is the way to sort it out. And that the piece that you had in the book about the fish packing, and you separated out those 2 individuals, employees, that's a vivid example. And now in the world of variants and vaccines and whether the vaccines are protecting, it's all the more important. So I hope we'll finally get serious about this. We got the resources are at the CDC,
Yeah.
but they're sitting there, sitting there.
It's actually worse than that. The resources are at the CDC, and the first step that the CDC made was to have privileged conversations with big corporations that are going to make a lot of money out of it,
Yeah.
and as opposed to opening up the conversation.
Right.
If it were me, if I were Biden, I'd call Joe DeRisi and say, "You're in charge. Here's the $1.2 billion. Figure out what to do with it." Seriously.
Right.
I mean, we may have to install you in the CDC for cosmetic purposes, but just do it.
Yeah.
And it's troubling that we have such talent and resources at our disposal, and we blow it. It's troubling. It bothers me on the level. Like, I had a really good girls softball team once, where all the girls I coached, all the girls, it was like an incredibly talented team. And when that team lost, I felt like shooting myself. Like, it was my fault.
Yeah.
It wasn't their fault. And I feel like our team lost because of the coaching and the managing, not because of the resources of the talent. The talent was there.
Yeah. The term I like to use on that is bureaucratic. It's just a bureaucracy that's pathogenic or pathologic, whatever. Yeah. I almost had a Post-it note on every single page, Michael. I've never had that before. It's a freaking masterpiece. Okay, it really is. I want to encourage everybody, Medscape and the audience, they should read this book if you want to, not just about the pandemic, which is, I think that part in itself is fascinating, but the warm up over 15 years that you nailed through these characters, these fascinating characters. So, Michael, thank you for this present that you gave us, this book.
Well, Eric, I'm grateful for your interest.